This story appears early in Mark's ministry as a word of Jesus' teaching and preaching and healing and spreading quickly against crowds that are so large, he had to teach by the lake. And he spoke to them in parables just before this context, saying, "To what shall I compare this new kingdom, not of Caesar, but of God? It's like a sower. It's like a seed. It's like a light on a hill. It's like the fertile earth." And with many similar parables, Mark tells us, Jesus spoke the word to them as much as they could understand. He didn't say anything to them without using a parable. And so hear these words this morning from Mark's Gospel, chapter 4, verses 35 through 41 from the New International Version. And that day when the evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let's go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took Jesus along just as he was in the boat. And there were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on the cushion. And the disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown, if we die?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. And he said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified, and they asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." So ends our reading. Let us meditate on these words in the sanctuary of our hearts and minds. Please pray with me. Come, Holy Spirit, fill our hearts, kindle us in the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, that we may all be renewed, and you shall renew the face of the earth. So on this July 4th, I want to begin with a question. When have you had to revise your beliefs about what you thought was true? When have you needed to re-examine or reinterpret a preferred history that was taught to you? Never, seldom, sometimes, often? Often? I suspect that for many of us, the stories we've learned about Christianity have needed to be re-examined. What really did happen, that first nativity scene, that first Christmas? How did that night really unfold? What were the events that led to Jesus's execution? Who was motivated for it? Who was really this historic Jesus versus the remembered Christ? How has Jesus been portrayed in history? It's needed a lot of revision as we've learned more about who tells the story and why, and whose voices are included and whose are not in the telling. Revisionist history is often used in a pejorative way by those who want to preserve the status quo. So I've learned to carefully consider who uses this term and what their motives might be. Because history, as we know, far too often is told by the winners, be it biblical or national or corporate or family history. And our search for truth far too often is whitewashed by the winners. Historian Aaron Bartram writes, "It's easy to see how some people might feel that their present understanding of their identity, their faith, their nation is threatened by new and unfamiliar historical arguments. If you're clinging to a particular narrative about the past because it's part of how you understand your place in the world, it can be easier to denounce a new narrative rather than to reconsider one's own old narrative. And this, I think, is especially true when the new historical narrative seems to take your story out of the center of the universe. Today, we find Jesus saying to his disciples, let's go across to the other side. I imagine they're wondering, across? Now? At night? We know how bad the squalls can get. What do you even know about night sailing, Jesus? Why can't we stay right here where it's safe and comfortable, Jesus? And in my imagining, I imagine Jesus saying to us now, urging us, let's go across to the other side. Because from the other side, we gain new perspectives and we evolve in our understanding. I imagine Jesus urging us as a country, as a nation, as a people of faith, to go across to the other side in search of a fuller truth about the hidden histories, especially about racism in this country. As a child, I learned how my ancestors bravely made the long and dangerous journey across the ocean from Europe in hopes of freedom and new life, and how they were greeted by that shining beacon of light shimmering in the night sky and across the waters of the New York City harbor, the Statue of Liberty, standing like a goddess with the words of Emma Lazarus' poem, The New Colossus, embodying the ideals of this country. You all know it, you can recite it with me. Give me your tired and your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuge of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. I'd learned as a child how other Europeans, from Columbus to the Pilgrims, courageously made the long and dangerous journey across to the other side of the ocean in search of religious freedom, in search of new lands, and how the brave colonists rose up and rebelled against the greedy British monarchy, protesting against the injustice of taxation without representation. How many of you learned that version of history too? Okay, but what was invisible to me from this version of history that I learned as a child were people of color whose stories were excluded. What was invisible to me were the stories of those who were not, in fact, immigrants. So often we hear this phrase, the United States is a nation of immigrants. Well, there's some problems with that phrase. That phrase hides the hidden histories of two major communities in this country. Indigenous people. Indigenous people were here first. They are not immigrants. This is their historic land. Starting in 1584, Europeans colonized North America using armed aggression, coercion, and violating agreements to displace and kill most indigenous people on this land. And for centuries, this history of genocide was whitewashed from our primary narratives as a country. Secondly, many African Americans in this country are not descended from immigrants who willingly came here. These were enslaved and trafficked people. Starting in 1619, African people were enslaved and trafficked into the American colonies. The practice of chattel slavery finally ended on June 19, 1865, now known as officially as a federal holiday, Juneteenth. For centuries, this history of slave trade was whitewashed from our primary narratives. Much of this country's wealth was built through inhumane exploitation. Histories that were whitewashed by our primary narratives. And I believe we have yet to come to terms as a nation with the pervasiveness of racism within this country. Throughout history, wave after wave of reform efforts are met with great resistance, like a storm at sea with waves crashing upon one another. And now it may be too little too late, particularly if we fail to simultaneously dismantle deep systems of injustice that have swamped far too many boats of the most vulnerable people for too long. The most recent resistance to reforms comes in the form of a powerful new narrative that the 2020 presidential election was stolen through voter fraud, stolen by people of color, stolen by people of different faiths and political and religious beliefs who are trying to undermine the greatness of this country, and that patriotic people were called to rise up to storm the Capitol on January 6th, to stop the fraudulent ballot counting, to protest this injustice, and now to work to end this fraudulent voting process. And the furious winds and waves of these polarizing narratives rock the little boat of this nation and threaten to capsize us. And we might feel like we are this little boat adrift at night. At times we can feel lonely, estranged from one another, beyond hope, lost in the dark, and maybe demonizing those on the other side. Perhaps evening has come for us as a nation. Evening had come for Jesus too. It had probably been a long day, maybe a long month or year. The crowds had been pressing upon him with their urgent demands. And yet Jesus turns his attention across the waters to the other side. He's tired and weary, perhaps as tired and weary as some of our Black and brown sisters and brothers are tired and weary of helping their white brothers and sisters to see a different shore. And so they set sail in the night to go to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, guided by knowledgeable fishermen who have in their lifetimes witnessed storms on the Sea of Galilee. Jesus is exhausted and he falls asleep. But then calamity arises and the waters begin to swamp the boat. And his terrified disciples there in the midst of the crashing wind and waves shout out, "Jesus, don't you care that we're about to die?" And I wonder if some people think that they will die in this new old retelling of a story that never properly got told or fully told to begin with. Some people may wonder if somehow we're changing the story or engaging in identity politics, as if by journeying the other side, we're engaging with the enemy. And yet we know that history and science and faith at their best are self-critiquing, self-correcting, ever seeking truth, a fuller truth, and evolving in the light of it. Might we have to revise the way we tell our story of July 4th? Yes. Should this be a problem? No. Is it a problem? Depends on who you ask. So historian Aaron Bartman writes, when we're at our best, historians aren't afraid to revise, to look again, because we believe that another look can only help, even if it muddles what we previously thought was clear. When done from a place of humility rather than defensiveness, and its questions offered in good faith, revision is what drives historical inquiry. The danger is not in practicing revisionist history. It's in constructing individual and collective lives around historical frameworks too shaky to be looked at again. Heather McGee puts it this way: racism has a cost for everyone. She's the author of The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. She says, we should celebrate everyone, because we're talking about freedom, our collective freedom, our collective liberation. In an interview with Trevor Noah, she delineates the benefits of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, saying, the US was born with this view of a zero-sum racial hierarchy built into the economic justification for stolen land, stolen people, and stolen labor. This is a very old idea. And yet, she continues, we've never gotten on the same page about our history. So I think it's not possible to move forward if we are still contesting the basic facts and even our present. We need to have a truth effort. Jesus says to his disciples, and he says to us now, let's go over to the other side. It's late in the day, and it's high time we do so as our country reckons with our past and struggles toward a more diverse and just future. I think we've heard from the overseers for far too long. It's time for this country's boat to leave the familiar shore of the cherished stories we think we know and tell for some at the cost of truth for many. It's time to make our way to the other side, to hear and to witness other perspectives, particularly those that didn't make it into either our history books or into our hearts. I pray that July 4th become a memory maker, reminding us of the many generations of Indigenous Americans killed and many generations of African descendant people held in captivity. May July 4th remind us of the radical changes that were needed, courageous efforts to include more and more of us in the promises of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And may it strengthen our resolve now to furthering changes urgently needed to end the continuing abuses that Black and Brown Americans experience systemically. After Jesus stills the storms, he asks his disciples, "Why are you afraid?" Perhaps just like us, the disciples are afraid of death, of loss, afraid of the unknown. Perhaps Jesus had learned to transform his own fear into peace, recognizing that the unknown, that loss, that change, that even death can bring forth new life for all of us, not just for some of us. And so may it be so with us. Amen. And we'll now join in singing the sermon response. You can rise as you're able. The Black New Century hymnal number 563, verse 1.